The Arizona sun was a tyrant, a merciless orb of fire in a bleached-out sky. It beat down on the military base, a sprawling, dusty monument to steel and grit. The year was 2024, and the air was thick with the scent of diesel, scorched earth, and the faint, acrid tang of gunpowder. For David, a 32-year-old civilian mechanic, the heat was a constant companion, a physical weight on his shoulders as he knelt beside the M1 Abrams tank. His face, smeared with grease and streaked with sweat, was a testament to hours spent in the unforgiving sun. His hands, calloused and strong, moved with a practiced grace that belied his humble appearance. David wasn't a soldier, didn't wear a uniform, and didn't hold a rank. He was a contractor, a lifeline for his family's struggling garage 20 miles away, a business his father had poured his life into. The military contract was their last hope, a chance to pull the family out of the financial quicksand that had been slowly consuming them. The pressure was immense, a heavy shadow that followed him from the moment he woke up until the last glimmer of sunset disappeared behind the distant mountains. Today was the day of a live fire test, a critical evaluation for a refurbished M1 Abrams tank. David had spent weeks on this machine, treating its every bolt and wire with the reverence of a master craftsman. He had replaced faulty parts, meticulously fine-tuned the engine, and checked every system from the tracks to the turret. But in the final hours of his inspection, he had felt it. Not seen it on a diagnostic screen, but felt it with his hands, a subtle, almost imperceptible vibration in the ammunition feed mechanism. It was a telltale sign of a critical misalignment, a ghost in the machine that no computer would ever detect. He had tried to warn Sergeant Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of a dozen tours and who wore his disdain for civilians like a badge of honor. Miller had simply spat a stream of chewing tobacco into the dust and scoffed. "Listen, kid," he had growled, his voice a gravelly rumble. "This tank was looked over by the best damn engineers from the manufacturer. It's perfect. You stick to the oil changes and let the professionals handle the serious stuff. This ain't your daddy's pickup truck." The words felt like a physical blow. The other mechanics, all younger and more eager to prove themselves, snickered behind their hands. They called him the rookie, the hunch guy, and whispered about how he was holding up the test. Next, David had approached Major Thompson, the officer in charge. Major Thompson, a man under immense pressure, with a reputation to uphold and a deadline to meet, had dismissed him with a curt wave of his hand. "Son, we have no time for hunches. The diagnostics are clear. We're going live." David stood there for a moment, the weight of their scorn heavier than the oppressive heat. He was just a mechanic with a gut feeling, a man whose entire existence was defined by the tools in his hands and the debt his family owed. In their world of protocol and data, his intuition was nothing more than a nuisance. As the crew prepared the tank, David retreated to the perimeter of the firing range, the desert wind whipping sand against his face. The other mechanics, emboldened by the dismissal of their superiors, openly mocked him. One mimicked his posture, hunched over an imaginary part. Another chuckled, heard he saw a ghost in the transmission. David ignored them, his gaze fixed on the tank, a monstrous machine of steel and firepower. He knew what he had felt. His hands, his years of experience, told him that a disaster was waiting to happen. The tank's engine roared to life, a powerful guttural sound that rattled the ground. David's heart hammered against his ribs. He watched Major Thompson give the signal, a clean, sharp motion of his arm. The first round was loaded. The turret began to turn. David closed his eyes, bracing himself for the silence that would precede the deafening blast, and hoping beyond hope that he was wrong. The first shot was a success, a deafening concussion that shook the very earth. The rusted-out car, 1,000 yards downrange, disintegrated in a cloud of dust and twisted metal. A roar of approval went up from the crew. Major Thompson smiled, a relieved, satisfied expression on his face, and clapped Sergeant Miller on the back. Good work, Miller. Flawless execution. For a moment, David felt a crushing wave of self-doubt. Had he been a fool? Had the pressure to save his family's business clouded his judgment? Had he just created a scene for nothing? He was about to turn and walk away, to accept the humiliation and retreat into the anonymity of his civilian role, when he heard it. It was a tiny, high-pitched rattle, a metallic chirp lost in the cacophony of the celebration and the tank's idling engine. But to David, it was the only sound in the world. He knew that sound intimately. He had heard it in the quiet solitude of his final inspection, a whisper that had screamed danger. Now it was louder, more insistent, a frantic and desperate rhythm in the belly of the beast. He looked at the tank, a fortress of steel, and saw the subtle tremor in its chassis that no one else seemed to notice. The vibration was a ghost, a clear sign that the ammunition feed mechanism was misaligned, a fraction of a millimeter off its mark. He knew what that meant. The next round, a massive, gleaming projectile of concentrated destruction, was on its way. The automatic loader, designed to be a marvel of precision, was now a ticking bomb. If that shell was fed into the chamber with the misalignment he had detected, it would jam. And if it jammed, the catastrophic pressure of the charge would detonate it inside the tank. The explosion would be immense, not only obliterating the tank and its crew, but also setting off a chain reaction in the nearby ordnance depot. That warehouse, just a quarter-mile away, was a silent graveyard of live ammunition, a potential nuclear-level event waiting to happen. The entire base could be leveled in a flash of fire and fury. Panic, cold and sharp, seized David. He couldn't just stand there, a helpless witness to a disaster he had foreseen. He looked at the loader, a young man with a determined face, reaching for the next shell. The time for deliberation was over. He had to act. Ignoring the sudden silence of the other mechanics, the shocked stares of the soldiers, he started to run. The ground seemed to stretch out before him, a vast expanse of dust and heat. He pumped his arms, his legs burning, his lungs screaming for air. He had to get to the tank, to stop the loader, to make them understand before it was too late. "Stop! Don't load the next round! There's a malfunction!" His voice was a raw, desperate cry carried on the desert wind. Sergeant Miller, seeing him charge across the firing range, his face a mask of primal fear, turned and bellowed, "What the hell are you doing, civilian? Get back to your post before I put you in a brig." Major Thompson, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fury, yelled, "Are you insane? We're in the middle of a live test." But David didn't stop. He ran faster, his legs a blur, his focus laser-sharp on the tank. He was no longer thinking about his family's debt, his reputation, or the humiliation he had endured. He was thinking about the lives of the men in that tank and the hundreds of others on the base. He was thinking about the silence of the desert after the explosion. The rattle was getting louder, a frantic metallic chirping that only he could hear. It was the sound of a countdown. David reached the tank just as the loader's gloved hand brushed against the cool metal of the next round. He threw himself against the tank's chassis, his body a shield, his mind a singular purpose. He grabbed the loader's arm with a grip of iron. "Don't!" he screamed, his voice hoarse from the exertion. "The feeder is misaligned! It's going to blow!" The loader looked at him, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. The sudden, frantic movement had frozen everyone on the range. The air, once thick with cheers, was now heavy with a suffocating silence. Sergeant Miller and Major Thompson arrived seconds later, their faces crimson with a fury that bordered on rage. Major Thompson grabbed David by the collar, his knuckles white. "You just jeopardized a multi-million-dollar test, you fool," he roared. But as he looked at David's eyes, he saw not a crazy man, but a man consumed by a desperate, terrifying certainty. It was in that moment of hesitation that another engineer, a younger one who had been quietly running diagnostics on a laptop, stepped forward. "Major," he said, his voice quiet but firm, I heard a sound too, a faint rattle. He might be right." The words, spoken with the authority of a professional, cut through the anger and confusion. Major Thompson's face went pale. The young engineer's words, combined with the raw fear he saw in David's eyes, forced him to reconsider. His eyes flickered from David to the enormous gleaming shell waiting to be loaded. He made the most difficult call of his career. "Stand down. Unload the round. We're running a full diagnostic." The order was given in a voice that was barely a whisper. The next few minutes were a blur of nervous, careful activity. The crew, under the watchful eyes of the now silent onlookers, carefully removed the round from the loading bay. The silence was heavy with anticipation, a suffocating tension that seemed to slow time itself. Finally, the senior specialist returned from the diagnostics tent, his face grim. He walked directly to Major Thompson, his head shaking slowly. "Major," he said, his voice barely audible, "the civilian was right. The feed mechanism was off by a fraction of a millimeter. We can't believe it didn't show up on the initial diagnostics. If that round had been loaded, the timing would have been off. The shell would have detonated in the chamber. It would have been a significant incident." Major Thompson's face went white. He looked at the ordnance depot in the distance, a silent, ticking time bomb that had been moments away from going off. He looked at the young man, covered in grease and sweat, who had stood against the weight of rank, protocol, and professional scorn, and had saved the day. The aftermath was a surreal mix of shock and profound relief. David was taken to the base's medical bay, not for injuries, but because his heart was racing so fast the doctors were worried. He was given water and a meal, and for the first time that day, he felt the cool, air-conditioned air on his skin. Sergeant Miller, humbled and shaken, came to his bedside. His gruff demeanor was gone, replaced by a deep and genuine respect. "I was wrong, kid," he said, his voice raspy. "You had a hell of a pair of eyes on you, and a hell of a gut." Later that evening, Major Thompson walked into the medical bay. He didn't say a word at first, just stood there, looking at David. Then he extended his hand, a gesture of profound respect and gratitude. "David," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was wrong. Your intuition and your courage saved a lot of lives today. Not just the lives in that tank, but the lives of every person on this base. We owe you a debt we can never repay." David, his own hand still shaky, took the major's firm grip. For the first time, he saw not a superior officer, but a man who had faced his own near disaster and was now recognizing the true meaning of heroism. The scorn was gone, replaced by respect. His family's garage was no longer in trouble, but a small part of a much larger victory, and David was no longer just a mechanic. He was a hero,